friends are since.
We live in an age where we are spoiled for choice when it comes to brilliant samplers. There's a whole range of them from Akai, including the Force, the MPC Live 2, the MPC 1, the MPC X. But you've also got things like the Dirty Wave M8, which is nice and portable. There's the SP404 Mark II, and a whole bunch of other devices that I'm sure you all know a lot more about than I do. Now, given that context, why on earth would anybody at this point choose to buy an old, very large, very impractical rack mount sampler like the Akai S2000, especially when you consider that it still uses floppy disks for storage, which by the way only can hold 1.44 megabytes per disk? Well, there are lots of answers to that question, obviously, and I've already done a video a couple of years ago where I talked about why I personally bought an Akai S2000. However, there was one thing in there that I hadn't really mentioned at the time, and that was that the Akai S2000 is ripe for circuit bending, and because of that, it can really smash up and fuck up your audio in very pleasing ways. To give you a demonstration of this, I've sequenced some drum samples that I've got on my Akai S2000 from my Squarp Hapax, and I'm going to play through them and let you hear the kind of thing that my S2000 can do. Now, the Akai S2000 can be modified in a number of different ways and also upgraded with things such as an 8-output expansion board, an effects board, an internal SCSI drive connection so that you don't have to connect up an external drive which would require power. You can replace the floppy disk drive with a USB emulator, and you can also do things like upgrading the RAM, etc., so you get more sample time. Now, some of these I have done. I was fortunate enough to get my hands on an Akai S2000 at a good price, which had the 8-output board in there already. This is fairly rare at this point because those boards are compatible with the MPC 2000 XL, and so you get all of these grubby MPC users buying up cheap Akai S2000s just so they can get the 8-output expansion for their beloved lo-fi hip-hop machine. If you do see an Akai S2000 which has got those boards in them already, then it's probably worth considering getting, even just for the resale value of them, but I guess, you know, I shouldn't tell you that. Now, my Akai S2000 is currently fairly souped up. It's got a whole bunch of added RAM, it's got the additional boards in there, it's got, you know, the floppy disk drive replacement and all that kind of thing. However, the real reason that I bought the S2000 in the first place was so that I could have it circuit bent, and I discovered that this was possible when I was browsing through circuitbenders.co.uk, which are a group or a collective, or maybe even just one guy, I'm not really sure, here in the UK, and they offer up these modifications for different kinds of legacy devices. Now, funnily enough, when I tried to research these circuit bent Akai S2000s in the past, the only video I seemed to be able to find was one video called Bent Akai S2000, and I started watching it before realising that actually the person wasn't talking about a circuit bent Akai S2000, they were talking about a literal bent in half S2000. So I thought I would share some of the things I've been doing with this to give you an idea of what it actually does, because it's something that kind of comes up every time I talk about the S2000, and it's, you know, it's a pretty cool thing to know about. For my next example, I've got a piano sample that is loaded into the S2000, which I'm then controlling via my Squarp Hapax, and I'm glitching it up, of course, with the modifications, I guess. can see from the example there, hopefully, that one of the cool things about this modification is that you can play about with a sequence or a loop, find a particular sound that gets produced from the combination of switches that are on there, and then play that using your controller, and you get some really wild and unpredictable effects that way. So how does all of this actually work? Well, hopefully from the examples that I've been showing you, you can see on the front of my Akai S2000 that circuit benders have added a selection of 3-way position switches. These are connected up to the RAM pins that are installed inside the Akai S2000, as far as I understand it anyway. And so when you engage these in different combinations, they do kind of wild and unpredictable things to the sounds. This can vary from quite musical and interesting effects, all the way up to total aural chaos and destruction. For the next example, I have loaded up a pad sound. Again, I'm sequencing it via an external controller somewhere, and you can see that I can get some really interesting kind of multi-layered, chaotic, pitch shifty style effects, which sound particularly pleasant, and then of course it goes on into something a bit less pleasant afterwards. There's a couple of things to be aware of with this modification. The first is that the effects that are triggered via the different, switch combinations only apply to samples that are stored in memory. So this doesn't act as a kind of incoming audio processor effects unit or anything. You have to record the sample, trigger it or sequence it in some way, and then the switches will have an effect because the samples are stored in RAM. On that point, if you are interested in that kind of thing, I do have another box here which has been circuit bent by circuit benders, which does do real-time audio glitching, which I can talk about in another video later on. Anyway, the second thing that's worth noting about this modification is that it can be destructive to the samples that are stored in RAM. And by that I mean that especially if you're going to be using a number of different switches in combination with each other, or if you want to go for some of the more extreme or hardcore effects, you can't necessarily always get back to the original sample just by resetting all of the switches to their neutral position. What you'll often find is that artifacts can be left over from some of the, more glitchy effects that you apply, or you can get completely different sounds than you might expect. Now, this isn't a huge deal from my perspective because one, I think it adds some character to the whole thing, the unpredictability of it is part of its charm, but also you can reload the original sample if you've got them saved on a floppy disk or an external hard disk or whatever it might be. But the important thing to know is that if you want to keep a sample and you're going to run it through this, then you should save it first, because if you don't, it'll be gone forever, and that is definitely something that I have done once or twice. In terms of musicality and usability of these kind of things, of course it's going to depend on your particular scenario, but on their own they might not seem as if they can be all that useful. But I find that if you slam a big pumping bass drum on something, throw a wee snare in there, then basically anything can sound musical. And so for this example, I've got a number of samples from my D110. That's a Roland kind of rack mount drum 80s synth thing. I've done a video on it, but they are playing alongside a synth line that I've sampled into my Akai S2000 and fucked up. So yeah, well, maybe this is music. Now the results that you'll get from this will vary drastically depending on the input source. So if you're using one-shot drum samples that are sequenced separately, like in the first instance I showed you earlier in the video, then that will be quite different from, say, a complete piece that you've sampled in as a loop. And for this next example, that's exactly what I'm doing. I've taken a wee passage from a piece that I've put together in my polyend play, I've sampled that into the Akai S2000, and then I'm mashing it up in there. At the end you can see that I have basically destroyed the original sequence completely, and it is now turned into this weird sound that I'm able to control using a MIDI controller like the Hapax or anything else for, you know, quite different results and purposes perhaps than what I put into it in the first place. Now, one of my favourite things to do with the Akai S2000 is run vocals through it, whether that's my own or, you know, a sample I found on the internet or whatever it might be. And I think that's because with vocals, they're already kind of intelligible, or usually vocals are intelligible because, you know, they're words. And so it's much more obvious when things glitch up. And so you can get these really interesting flavours, whether it's kind of robotic sounds or weird repeats or just noise in general. And so for this next example, that's what I'm doing. I've taken a sample that I've recorded from my polyend play into the Akai S2000. I'm then sequencing that same sample from the polyend play on the Akai S2000, and I'm also playing drums which are not being sampled. They're actually playing live with the audio coming out of the polyend play, and that'll make more sense when you watch this.
All over the world, 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 all over the world.
really love the S2000. It's such a bizarre, idiosyncratic thing, and in many ways kind of obsolete and pointless, but there's something about it that just draws me to it, particularly now that it's been modified. I would highly recommend circuitbenders.co.uk, by the way, if you haven't seen their site already. I'm not getting paid or sponsored or anything like that for this. I genuinely really like them. I've bought a couple of things from them, and I have my eye on a few other things in future. Hopefully this has inspired some of you to dig out your old dusty S2000s from a cupboard somewhere and give them a new lease of life, because they can do some pretty interesting things, and if not, then you can always sell them on, because the price of them has rapidly been increasing over the past few years, and I like to think that's because of my videos, but probably not. If you want to see more of the examples from this and more of the recordings I did as part of making this video, then you can check them out on my Patreon. I've uploaded a 10-minute thing of me messing about with switches and, you know, different input devices. I've also uploaded all of the audio there, so you can go and, I don't know, do whatever you want with it. Until next time, goodbye.